like an invading army. And every single person at Victor Marchetti's Thanksgiving party stopped mid-conversation to stare at the convoy that blocked out the sunset behind them. The lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the mansion's grand entrance, where Victor stood frozen with a champagne glass halfway to his lips, his face draining of color as he counted the vehicles that kept coming and coming and coming. His guests pressed against the windows and crowded onto the balconies, trying to see who had arrived with enough power to bring 50 armed vehicles to the most exclusive Thanksgiving gathering in the city. The door of the lead SUV opened, and Isabella Marchetti stepped out wearing a black suit that probably cost more than Victor's entire party, her heels clicking against marble like gunshots as she surveyed the mansion she'd once been prisoner in. She looked different than the broken woman who'd fled this place 3 years ago, standing taller and moving with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you had an army at your back and nothing left to fear. Victor's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble steps as recognition hit him, as he understood that his ex-wife, who he'd tormented and controlled and broken, had somehow become powerful enough to show up at his party with a fleet that rivaled his own. The guests murmured and whispered because everyone in their world knew the story of Isabella Marchetti, the wife who'd escaped Victor's brutality and disappeared so completely that most people assumed she was dead. Isabella walked toward the entrance with 49 SUVs behind her and armed men emerging from each vehicle. And Victor's security team looked to him for orders, but he was too shocked to give any. She climbed the steps, slowly letting everyone get a good look at her transformation from victim to threat. And when she reached Victor, she smiled in a way that promised this evening would be unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. My sister told me I'd never make it as a storyteller, that I should stick to my safe corporate job instead of chasing, and shows me that taking risks matters. Drop up in your city right now. Mind. This woman is about to remind her abusive ex-husband why underestimating her was his biggest mistake. Victor finally found his voice and asked what she was doing here. And Isabella reminded him that he'd sent her an invitation, that he'd written a personal note saying he hoped they could be civil for old times' sake. Her voice carried across the silent crowd as she said she decided to accept his invitation and bring some friends along for support, gesturing to the 50 vehicles and the 100 armed men who'd stepped out of them. Victor's face went from pale to red as rage replaced shock, and he told her she wasn't welcome here, that showing up with an army was a declaration of war. Isabella laughed and said she wasn't here to start a war, just to enjoy Thanksgiving dinner with her ex-husband and remind him of everything he'd lost when he let her walk away alive. The crowd didn't know whether to be terrified or fascinated as Isabella walked past Victor into the mansion she'd once been trapped in, and her armed escort followed, creating a buffer between her and everyone else. Victor's guests parted like the Red Sea as Isabella made her way through rooms where she'd been humiliated and hurt, where Victor had systematically destroyed her spirit over 5 years of marriage that felt like 50. She found the dining room already set for dinner with Victor's new girlfriend sitting at the head of the table where Isabella used to sit, and Isabella smiled at this young woman who had no idea what she'd gotten herself into. The girlfriend looked terrified as Isabella approached, and Isabella told her very gently to run while she still could, that Victor Marchetti destroyed everything he claimed to love. Victor appeared in the doorway, surrounded by his own security team, trying to look in control while his entire party descended into chaos, and he demanded Isabella leave immediately or face consequences. Isabella asked what consequences exactly, whether he planned to hurt her the way he used to, and she watched his face change as he realized every word she spoke was being heard by his guests and his business associates and his new girlfriend. She told the room about the 5 years she'd spent as Victor's wife, about the broken ribs and black eyes and cigarette burns that he'd hidden under expensive dresses and jewelry. She described being locked in rooms for days and being told she was worthless and being made to believe that leaving was impossible because Victor owned everything and everyone. The guests shifted uncomfortably because some of them had suspected and none of them had helped. And Victor's new girlfriend was crying as she realized the man she was dating was a monster. Victor shouted that Isabella was lying, that she was trying to ruin him out of spite, but Isabella pulled out her phone and projected photos onto the wall behind her. The images showed Isabella at her worst, bruised and broken and barely recognizable. Documentation she'd kept hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to use it. Victor lunged toward her, but Isabella's security moved faster, creating a wall of armed men between them. And suddenly Victor was the one who looked powerless in his own home. Isabella explained very calmly how she'd escaped 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to survive, how she'd made her way to Victor's biggest rival and offered them everything she knew about his operations. She'd given them access codes and shipping routes and the locations of money that Victor thought was hidden. And in exchange, they protected her and given her a percentage of everything they'd taken from him. Victor's face went purple with rage as he realized his ex-wife was responsible for the losses he'd suffered over the past 3 years. The shipments that disappeared and the accounts that were drained in the territory he'd lost to rivals, he couldn't understand how they'd gotten so strong. Isabella had been systematically destroying his empire from the shadows while he thought she was dead or hiding in fear. She told him she'd built her own fortune from the ruins of his, that every dollar he'd lost had made her richer, and the 50 SUVs outside represented just a fraction of the power she now commanded. Victor's guests were backing toward exits, realizing this dinner party had turned into something dangerous. And his new girlfriend was already gone, fled through a back door the moment she understood who Victor really was. Isabella walked through the mansion, taking in details she'd memorized during years of captivity, and she told Victor's remaining guest stories about each room, about being dragged down this hallway, or locked in that closet, or beaten in the library that Victor used as his office. Every word was a nail in Victor's reputation, and he could do nothing but watch as she destroyed him socially the way he'd once destroyed her physically. Victor's business associates were making calls and reassessing relationships because a man who couldn't control his ex-wife showing up at his party wasn't a man who could be trusted with serious operations. Isabella saw the power shifting in real time as people who'd feared Victor started calculating whether they should fear her more, and she felt satisfaction that went beyond simple revenge. She found herself in a master bedroom where she'd spent so many nights terrified and hurting, and Isabella stood there remembering the woman she'd been compared to the woman she'd become. Victor appeared in the doorway, looking defeated in ways that violence never could have achieved, and he asked what she wanted from him. Isabella said she wanted him to understand what he'd lost, that the broken woman he'd tortured had become someone more powerful than he'd ever be. She wanted him to spend the rest of his life knowing that underestimating her had been his fatal mistake, that letting her escape instead of killing her had given her the opportunity to become his worst nightmare. Victor asked if she was going to kill him, and Isabella laughed, saying death would be mercy, that she was going to let him live and watch as she took everything he'd built piece by piece. She'd already taken his money and his territory and his reputation, and eventually she'd take his freedom too when she was ready to give authorities evidence of crimes he thought were buried. She walked back downstairs to find the party completely empty except for her security team and Victor's staff, who looked uncertain about whose orders to follow. Isabella told them they were all fired effective immediately, that she now owned this mansion through shell companies she'd established, and they should collect their belongings and leave before the new security team arrived. Victor followed her down the stairs, shouting that she couldn't do this, that this was his home, and Isabella showed him the deed with her name on it. She explained she'd been buying his assets through proxies for 2 years, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal herself. And that moment was now, when he was surrounded by witnesses and couldn't do anything without destroying himself further. His security team looked at him waiting for orders, but Victor had none to give, had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered, he couldn't see a path forward. Isabella's people were already securing the mansion and changing locks, and Victor found himself being escorted out of his own home by men who used to fear him. Isabella watched from the grand entrance as Victor was put into one of her SUVs to be driven to a property she owned in a neighborhood far less prestigious than this one, and she felt nothing looking at the man who'd once made her feel so small. He was just a pathetic bully who'd been given power and used it to hurt someone weaker, and now that power had been taken away, he was revealed as ordinary and sad. Her second in command, asked if she wanted them to do anything else to Victor, and Isabella said no. That living with the knowledge of how completely she'd beaten him was punishment enough. She walked through the mansion that was now hers, and she thought about the woman who'd fled from here 3 years ago, bleeding and terrified, and certain she'd never be safe again. That woman had found safety with Victor's enemies, had proven herself valuable by giving them information that had shifted the balance of power in the city, and had been smart enough to demand a real partnership instead of just protection. She'd learned their business and made connections and built her own operation until she was wealthy and powerful in her own right. Isabella stood in the mansion's master suite and stripped off the expensive suit jacket, letting it fall to the floor of the room where Victor had once controlled every aspect of her existence, and she felt a savage satisfaction in claiming this space as her own. Her phone buzzed with messages from her business partners congratulating her on the power move, and she responded efficiently while her team secured the property and swept for surveillance devices that Victor had undoubtedly installed throughout. The man who'd helped her escape 3 years ago, Diego Reyes, called asking if the party had gone as planned, and Isabella told him it had exceeded expectations. That Victor's face when he realized she owned his home had been worth every risk they'd taken. Diego laughed and said he'd told her that patient revenge was sweeter than quick violence, and Isabella admitted he'd been right about that and so many other things. She walked through each room of the mansion, methodically reclaiming spaces where trauma had occurred, and with each step, she felt lighter, as if walking through as the owner instead of the prisoner was erasing old pain. The library where Victor had broken her ribs was now her office. The bedroom where he'd terrorized her was now just a room she'd sell to the highest bidder, and the dining room where he'd humiliated her in front of guests was now the place where she'd humiliated him in front of his entire social circle. Her security chief reported that Victor had been delivered to the apartment Isabella owned in a working-class neighborhood, and that he tried to leave, but found his credit cards declined and his phone disconnected. Isabella had systematically cut off every resource Victor had, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that his ex-wife had orchestrated his complete destruction. She thought about the night she'd escaped, running through rain with broken ribs and a black eye, knowing Victor would kill her if his men caught her. She'd made it to Diego's territory purely on desperation and luck, stumbling into one of his clubs and begging the bouncer to let her speak to whoever was in charge. Diego had taken one look at her bruised face and Victor's wife written all over her expensive dress, and he'd made a calculation that changed both their lives. He'd offered her protection in exchange for information, and Isabella had given him everything, every password and contact and secret that Victor thought was safe. She'd expected Diego to use her and discard her the way Victor had, but instead he'd treated her like a valuable partner, had taught her the business, and given her opportunities to prove herself. Within 6 months, she was running operations. Within a year, she was making deals, and within 2 years, she'd built enough wealth and connections to be genuinely powerful in her own right. Diego had become the father figure Isabella never had, mentoring her and pushing her and believing she could be more than Victor's broken victim. He'd been the one to suggest buying Victor's assets through shell companies, slowly acquiring everything Victor owned until the moment was right to reveal the truth. Isabella had thought he was being overly cautious wanting to wait 3 years, but tonight proved Diego understood revenge better than she did. Her phone rang with a blocked number, and Isabella knew it was Victor before she answered. Could picture him standing in the bare apartment trying to understand how his life had collapsed in one evening. She answered, and Victor was screaming incoherently about betrayal and theft and how she'd pay for this. And Isabella let him rant until he ran out of breath before speaking very calmly. She told him this was justice, not revenge, that she was simply taking back what he'd stolen from her, which was 5 years of her life, and her sense of safety and her belief that love was real. Victor said he'd loved her, and Isabella laughed. Said if that was love, then she'd rather be hated, that his version of love had left her broken and terrified and wishing she was dead. She told him she was keeping the mansion and selling off his other properties, and the money would fund shelters for women escaping situations like hers. Victor threatened to go to the police, and Isabella reminded him that would require explaining how he'd lost everything. And the story involved admitting to crimes that would put him in prison for decades. She had documentation of everything, witness statements from former staff, evidence that would bury him if he tried to fight back legally. Victor realized he was trapped completely, that Isabella had thought of everything and left him no moves. She hung up and blocked his number, feeling nothing about his pain. And she thought about the Isabella who'd married Victor at 23, believing he was sophisticated and powerful and everything she wanted. That young woman had been naive about what power looked like, had confused control for strength and possessiveness for passion. And by the time she understood the difference, it was too late to leave safely. Diego arrived at the mansion an hour later with his wife and his advisors, and they walked through the property, discussing what Isabella should do with it. Diego suggested she sell it and be done with the memories, but Isabella said she wanted to keep it, wanted to transform it from a place of pain into something useful. She was thinking maybe a headquarters for her operations or a training facility for women who wanted to learn the business, something that would honor the woman she'd been by supporting who she was becoming. Diego's wife, Maria, hugged Isabella and said she was proud of how far she'd come, that the terrified woman they'd taken in 3 years ago had become someone formidable and strong. Maria had been the one to teach Isabella about business operations and negotiation, had showed her that being a woman in their world required being twice as smart and 3 times as ruthless as the men. Isabella credited Maria with teaching her that power wasn't about physical strength, but about strategy and patience and knowing when to strike. They sat in the dining room, where hours ago Victor's guests had witnessed his downfall, and Diego's team discussed the practical implications of what Isabella had done. Taking over Victor's mansion so publicly was a declaration that she was no longer hiding, no longer operating through proxies, and everyone in their world would now know that Isabella Marchetti had become a major player. Some people would see this as opportunity to make deals with someone new, and others would see it as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Diego warned that Victor had allies who might try to retaliate on his behalf, and Isabella said she'd been preparing for that possibility for months. She had her own alliances now, her own security, and her own reputation for being someone you didn't cross. The past 3 years had taught her how to read people and situations, how to anticipate moves and counter them, and she was ready for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number containing just an address and a time, and Isabella showed it to Diego, who recognized it as belonging to the Antonelli family. The Antonellis were old money and old power, had been in the business for generations, and if they were reaching out, it meant they wanted to talk about the power vacuum Isabella had just created by destroying Victor. Diego said she should meet with them, but bring heavy security, that the Antonellis respected strength and would test her to see if she was as formidable as tonight suggested. Isabella agreed and started making arrangements, knowing this meeting could establish her as Victor's legitimate replacement or could be a trap designed to eliminate her before she got too powerful. The next morning, Isabella awoke in the mansion's master suite and felt strange sleeping in the bed where Victor had once controlled her nights. But she forced herself to stay there because running from memories gave them power. She got up and prepared for the meeting with the Antonellis with the same care she'd prepared for Victor's party, choosing clothes that projected power without arrogance, and weapons that were subtle but accessible. Diego insisted on accompanying her with a full security detail, and they drove to the address in a convoy that was smaller than last night's 50 SUVs, but still substantial enough to make a statement. The Antonelli compound was in the hills overlooking the city, old stone and manicured gardens that had been in their family for 70 years, and Isabella felt the weight of history as they drove through gates that had seen generations of power plays. Vincent Antonelli met them in a study lined with books that had probably never been read, and he was exactly what Isabella expected, silver-haired and sharp-eyed with the kind of confidence that came from never doubting you were the most important person in any room. He gestured for Isabella and Diego to sit while his own security stood against the walls, and Isabella noted their positions and calculated exit routes out of habit. Vincent said he'd heard about last night's party and wanted to meet the woman who destroyed Victor Marchetti so thoroughly. and Isabella said she'd simply taken back what was hers and taught Victor that underestimating people had consequences. Vincent smiled and said he'd always thought Victor was a fool for treating his wife so badly, that smart men knew powerful women were assets, not threats. And Isabella couldn't tell if this was genuine or if Vincent was testing her reaction. He asked what her plans were now that she'd taken Victor's territory, and Isabella explained she was consolidating operations and establishing herself as a legitimate power in the city. Vincent said legitimate power required respect from the families who'd been running things for decades, and that respect had to be earned through proving you understood the rules and could be trusted to follow them. Isabella said she understood the rules but had her own ideas about how things should operate, that she'd spent 3 years learning from Diego and building relationships, and she wasn't going to be anyone's subordinate just because she was new. Vincent's expression shifted from patronizing to genuinely interested, and he said most people meeting with him for the first time showed more deference. Isabella told him deference was for people who needed something, and while she respected his family's history, she didn't need his permission to operate. She'd proven herself capable by taking down Victor, who everyone thought was untouchable, and if Vincent wanted to work with her, she was open to that. But if he wanted to challenge her, she was ready for that too. Diego tensed beside her because Isabella was being more aggressive than they planned, but she knew men like Vincent only respected strength. Vincent laughed and said he liked her, that she reminded him of his grandmother, who'd run their operations for 20 years and hadn't taken disrespect from anyone. He told Isabella he had no interest in challenging her, that Victor's fall had created opportunities for everyone, and he'd rather have Isabella as an ally than an enemy. They spent the next hour discussing territories and arrangements, and by the end, Isabella had agreements that would have taken most people years to establish. Driving back to the mansion, Isabella felt the full weight of what she'd accomplished in 24 hours, how she'd gone from Victor's escaped victim to a recognized power in the criminal underworld. Diego said he was proud of how she'd handled Vincent, that being respectful but not deferential was exactly the right tone, and Isabella said she'd learned from watching Diego navigate similar situations. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago who couldn't imagine surviving, let alone thriving, and she felt grateful for the desperation that had driven her to Diego's territory. If Victor hadn't been so brutal, she might never have found the courage to leave, and if she hadn't left, she'd never have discovered she was capable of so much more than being someone's victim. Victor called from a burner phone 2 days later, and his voice had lost all its authority, reduced to begging Isabella to give him back something, anything, so he could survive. Isabella listened to him plead and felt nothing except mild curiosity about how quickly powerful men crumbled when their resources disappeared, and she told him very calmly that he'd get nothing from her except the mercy of staying alive as long as he stayed quiet and stayed away. He said he had information she'd want, secrets about other families and operations that could help her expand her territory, and Isabella laughed because Victor still thought the world operated on the same rules he'd used. She told him she didn't need his scraps of information, that she'd built her own intelligence network and had better sources than a washed-up former boss who'd let his wife destroy him. Victor's desperation turned to rage, and he threatened to tell everyone how she'd betrayed him, how she'd stolen from her own husband, and Isabella reminded him that she had recordings of this conversation where he admitted to having criminal secrets. She said if he went public with anything, she'd release evidence that would put him in prison for the rest of his life, and then she hung up and blocked the burner number 2. Her operations were expanding faster than she'd anticipated, with former Victor associates reaching out to pledge loyalty to someone who'd proven more capable than their old boss. Isabella was careful about who she accepted, vetting everyone through Diego's intelligence network and her own instincts about who could be trusted. Some people she rejected outright because they'd been too close to Victor during the years he'd hurt her, and Isabella wasn't interested in working with anyone who'd witnessed her abuse and done nothing. Maria helped her establish protocols for the new organization, and Isabella insisted on rules that protected women and children because she'd lived through what happened when powerful men had no boundaries. Her operation wouldn't traffic in anything that exploited vulnerable people, wouldn't use violence against families, and wouldn't tolerate anyone abusing their power over subordinates. Diego said these rules would cost them some opportunities, and Isabella said she'd rather make less money than become the thing she'd escaped from. Word spread that Isabella Marchetti ran a cleaner operation than most, and she started attracting people who were tired of working for bosses like Victor, who ruled through fear and cruelty. Her organization grew, with talented people who appreciated having leadership that valued competence over brutality. And within 2 months, Isabella was running operations across 5 territories with revenue that exceeded what Victor had managed at his prime. The other families watched this rise with varying degrees of concern and respect, and Isabella received invitations to meetings where decisions about the city's criminal landscape were made. She attended these meetings with Diego initially for support, but quickly established herself as someone who spoke with authority and backed up her positions with solid reasoning. The old guard bosses didn't like having a woman at the table, but they couldn't deny that Isabella commanded resources and loyalty that made her impossible to ignore. Vincent Antonelli became an unexpected ally, respecting Isabella's intelligence and appreciating that she kept her word when they made deals. He told her privately that she reminded him of his late wife, who'd been the real power behind his operations for 30 years, and that smart men surrounded themselves with capable people regardless of gender. Isabella appreciated his support, while also recognizing he was positioning himself to benefit from a rise, and she accepted that alliance in their world always came with strategic calculation. She hired a security specialist to upgrade the mansion's defenses because becoming more visible meant becoming more vulnerable to people who resented her success. The specialist was a woman named Chun who'd worked protection for politicians and celebrities before getting tired of babysitting entitled people. And Isabella hired her immediately because Chun understood that security for someone like Isabella required thinking like both defender and attacker. Chun walked through the mansion, pointing out vulnerabilities and suggesting modifications. And within a week, the property was transformed into a fortress that looked beautiful but was nearly impossible to breach. Isabella felt safer than she had since escaping Victor, and she credited Chun with giving her the ability to sleep without nightmares about him breaking in to hurt her again. Victor made one more attempt at contact by showing up at one of Isabella's legitimate businesses and demanding to speak with her, and her security team detained him before he got past the lobby. Isabella watched on security cameras as Victor was escorted out while screaming about betrayal and theft, and she felt pity for this man who still didn't understand that his own actions had created his downfall. She had Chin deliver a message to Victor that if he approached any of her properties or people again, he'd be arrested on charges that Isabella had been holding back, and that would be the end of his freedom permanently. Victor apparently believed the threat because he disappeared completely after that, and Isabella heard through intelligence networks that he'd left the city entirely, relocating to some nowhere town where nobody knew his name or his history. Part of her had wanted a more dramatic confrontation where Victor acknowledged everything he'd done and apologized, but Isabella recognized that was a fantasy that wouldn't bring satisfaction anyway. The real victory was building a life where Victor was irrelevant, where she had so much power and success that thinking about him was a waste of her valuable time. Her first holiday season as an established power was surreal, with Isabella hosting Christmas gatherings at the mansion where she'd once been prisoner. She invited her entire organization and their families, and the house that had witnessed so much pain was filled with laughter and children playing and people who were loyal to her by choice, not fear. Diego and Maria stood with her watching everyone celebrate, and Maria said this was what victory looked like, not destruction of enemies, but creation of something better. Isabella received a letter in January from a woman she didn't know, thanking her for the shelter that had been established with proceeds from Victor's assets. The woman wrote that she'd escaped her own abusive husband, and the shelter had given her a safe place to stay while figuring out her next steps, and knowing that someone who'd survived similar trauma had created this resource made her feel less alone. Isabella cried reading that letter because it proved her suffering had been transformed into something that helped others, and that felt more meaningful than any amount of revenge. She framed the letter and hung it in her office as a reminder of why she'd fought so hard to escape and rebuild. And whenever she felt exhausted by the responsibilities of running her organization, she looked at those words and remembered that her power could be used to protect people who needed protection. Diego said she was becoming the kind of leader who inspired genuine loyalty instead of fearful obedience, and that was rarer and more valuable than most people understood. Valentine's Day brought unexpected complications when a younger man named Marcus, who worked in her operations, asked her to dinner, and Isabella realized she hadn't thought about dating or relationships since leaving Victor. The idea of trusting someone intimately again felt impossible, and she declined gently by saying she wasn't ready for anything romantic yet. Marcus said he understood and hoped she'd let him know if that changed, and Isabella appreciated that he accepted her boundary without pushing or making her feel guilty. She thought about whether she'd ever be ready to try again, whether the damage Victor had done was permanent or if eventually she could trust someone not to hurt her. Maria said healing wasn't linear, and Isabella shouldn't rush into anything before she was ready. That being powerful and successful didn't mean she had to have a romantic relationship if she didn't want one. Isabella valued Maria's perspective because Maria had survived her own trauma before meeting Diego, and she understood that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for yourself was protect your peace. By spring, Isabella had established herself so thoroughly that people stopped referring to her as Victor's ex-wife and started calling her Isabella Marchetti, like her identity existed independent of him. That shift felt significant, proof that she'd successfully created a new life that wasn't defined by what she'd escaped from, but by what she'd built. She expanded into legitimate business ventures, using her criminal profits to invest in real estate and technology startups and companies that aligned with her values. Diego said she was smart to diversify because criminal empires always eventually fell, but well-invested money could sustain you through any storm. Isabella listened and learned, always thinking 10 years ahead about what sustainability looked like. Her mother reached out after 2 years of silence, having heard through family networks about Isabella's success, and she wanted to reconnect with her daughter. Isabella met her at a neutral location with security nearby, and her mother cried, seeing how much Isabella had changed, how she'd gone from Victor's dominated wife to someone who commanded rooms with her presence. Her mother apologized for not helping during the marriage, for believing Victor's explanations about Isabella's injuries, for choosing to see what was comfortable instead of what was true. Isabella accepted the apology while also explaining she wasn't ready for a close relationship yet, that rebuilding trust would take time after years of feeling abandoned when she needed support most. They agreed to occasional lunches where they could slowly work toward understanding each other, and Isabella felt proud of herself for setting boundaries instead of accepting a relationship that might hurt her. Diego said, learning to protect yourself emotionally was just as important as protecting yourself physically, and Isabella was getting better at both. Summer brought a challenge when one of the old guard families tried to move into territory Isabella had claimed, apparently testing whether she'd defend her boundaries or back down to avoid conflict. Isabella called a meeting with the family's leadership and explained very clearly that she'd claimed that territory through legitimate deals and wouldn't give it up without a fight. The family boss was a man in his 60s who'd been running operations since before Isabella was born, and he clearly expected her to be intimidated by his history and reputation. Instead, Isabella laid out exactly what would happen if he continued encroaching, including which of his operations she'd disrupt and which of his allies she'd turn against him. And the man's face went from condescending to concerned as he realized she'd done extensive homework. They negotiated a boundary that respected both their interests, and Isabella walked away knowing she'd passed another test of her leadership. Diego said the old families would keep testing her until they accepted she wasn't going anywhere, and Isabella said she was ready for whatever test came because she'd already survived the worst things she could imagine. The real test came in September when Victor resurfaced with a new partner, an ambitious dealer from out of state who didn't understand the city's dynamics and thought Victor's knowledge could help him establish territory. Isabella's intelligence network reported that Victor was telling his new partner about her weaknesses and vulnerabilities, painting himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife who'd stolen his empire through manipulation rather than capability. Diego wanted to handle Victor permanently, but Isabella said no, that killing him would make him a martyr and give credibility to his victim narrative. Instead, she arranged for Victor's new partner to receive detailed documentation of Victor's history, including photos of what he'd done to Isabella and testimonies from former associates about his incompetence and brutality. The partner dropped Victor within 48 hours and sent Isabella a message saying he didn't do business with men who beat women. Victor's attempt to rebuild failed spectacularly and publicly, with everyone in their world learning that he'd tried to undermine Isabella and been rejected so thoroughly that even criminals with flexible morals wanted nothing to do with him. Isabella heard through her network that Victor had become essentially unemployable in their industry, too toxic to work with and too incompetent to operate independently. She felt satisfaction that was cold and complete, knowing Victor would spend the rest of his life as a cautionary tale about what happened when powerful men mistook cruelty for strength. Diego said she'd handled it perfectly by letting Victor destroy himself rather than making him into something he wasn't, and Isabella agreed that the best revenge was letting people see exactly who Victor had always been without her there to absorb the blame. Marcus asked her to dinner again in October, and this time Isabella said yes, curious about whether she could trust someone new even in small ways. They went to a restaurant that wasn't connected to either of their operations, just a quiet place where they could talk without performance or strategy, and Isabella found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected. Marcus was different from Victor in every way that mattered, listening when she spoke instead of talking over her, asking questions about her opinions instead of telling her what to think, respecting her boundaries when she said she wasn't ready to discuss certain topics. Isabella kept waiting for him to reveal ulterior motives or try to control her, but weeks passed, and Marcus remained consistently respectful and genuine. She told Maria she was confused about whether she was attracted to Marcus or just relieved that he wasn't abusive, and Maria said both could be true, that after Victor, her baseline for acceptable behavior was so low that basic human decency felt extraordinary. Maria suggested Isabella take things slowly and pay attention to how Marcus made her feel, whether she felt more like herself or less like herself when she was with him. Isabella discovered she felt more like herself with Marcus than she did with most people, able to talk about things beyond business and strategy, sharing opinions about books and movies, and whether pineapple belonged on pizza. These ordinary conversations felt revolutionary after years of every interaction being about power and survival, and Isabella started to believe that maybe she could have a personal life that wasn't defined by trauma. By November, they'd been dating for 2 months, and Marcus still hadn't pushed for more than kissing, seemingly content to move at whatever pace Isabella needed. She appreciated his patience while also feeling frustrated with herself for being so damaged that normal relationship progression felt terrifying, and one night, she told him she was sorry for being difficult. Marcus said she wasn't difficult, she was careful, and that was different and completely understandable given what she'd survived. He told her he'd wait as long as she needed because she was worth waiting for, and Isabella cried because nobody had ever said that to her before, had ever made her feel like her healing timeline mattered more than their desires. She invited him to Thanksgiving dinner at the mansion, wanting him to meet Diego and Maria and see the life she'd built. Marcus arrived early to help with preparations, and Isabella watched him interact with her security team and staff, noting how he treated everyone with respect regardless of their position. And she thought about how Victor had treated staff like they were invisible or obstacles. Diego pulled her aside and said Marcus seemed like a good man, but to stay cautious because people could hide their true nature for a long time. Isabella appreciated the concern, while also feeling confident in her assessment of Marcus. And she told Diego she'd survive Victor by learning to read people, and Marcus read as genuine in ways Victor never had even at the beginning. The dinner was large, with Isabella's entire inner circle and their families, and a mansion that had once held only pain now held laughter and a genuine affection. She looked around the table and felt proud of what she created. This family built on choice and loyalty rather than blood and obligation. and she thought about how far she'd come from the broken woman who'd fled this house 3 years ago. Marcus fit naturally into the group, talking easily with Diego about business and making Maria laugh with stories about his grandmother, who'd apparently been a force of nature. Isabella watched him integrate into her life and felt hope that maybe she could have both power and love, that surviving Victor didn't mean she had to be alone forever. Victor sent a message through an intermediary asking if Isabella would consider a truce, saying he was trying to move on with his life and would appreciate if she'd stop blocking his attempts at employment. Isabella considered the request and discussed it with Diego and Maria, trying to decide if extending mercy would be weakness or strength. Maria said mercy was always strength when it came from a position of power, that Isabella had already won so completely that Victor posed no threat. Diego was more cautious, warning that desperate men did desperate things, but he ultimately agreed the decision was Isabella's to make. Isabella decided to stop actively blocking Victor's employment while maintaining surveillance on him, giving him a chance to rebuild something small while keeping the option to destroy him again if he became a problem. She sent word through the same intermediary that she'd stop interfering with Victor's attempts to work, but that any attempt to undermine her or harm anyone associated with her would result in immediate and permanent consequences. The intermediary reported that Victor had cried receiving the message, apparently overwhelmed that Isabella was giving him any mercy at all after what he'd done. Isabella felt nothing about his tears, no satisfaction or pity, just a distant acknowledgement that Victor's suffering was his own creation. She'd moved so far beyond needing his pain to fuel her healing that his emotional state was irrelevant to her well-being, and that detachment felt like the truest victory. Christmas brought proposals from two different families suggesting marriage alliances between Isabella and their sons, strategic partnerships designed to consolidate power across territories. Isabella declined both politely, explaining she wasn't interested in marriages based on business advantage, that she'd already lived through one relationship where love was secondary strategy and wouldn't repeat that mistake. Diego said she was smart to prioritize her own happiness over political advantage, that she had enough power to not need marriage alliances, and Isabella appreciated his support of her choosing personal fulfillment over empire building. She thought about how different her life would have been if she'd had Diego as a father figure when she was young, someone who taught her that her value extended beyond what she could do for powerful men. Marcus gave her a gift for Christmas that was so thoughtful it made her cry, a first edition of her favorite book that he'd tracked down through rare book dealers. He said he'd remembered her mentioning it months ago in passing, and Isabella realized he'd been paying attention to small details about what mattered to her, collecting information not to use against her, but to make her happy. She kissed him and told him she was falling in love with him, and Marcus said he'd been in love with her for months, but hadn't wanted to pressure her by saying it first. They spent the night talking about what a future together might look like, and Isabella felt hope bloom in her chest that maybe she could have a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The new year brought opportunities for expansion that would make Isabella one of the 5 most powerful operators in the city, and she spent January negotiating deals and establishing new territories. Her reputation had grown beyond her relationship to Victor until most people didn't even know she'd been married to him, knew only that Isabella Marchetti was someone whose word was reliable and whose displeasure was to be avoided. She attended a gathering of the city's major families in February where decisions about territorial boundaries were being finalized for the year, and Isabella sat at that table as an equal to men who'd been in the business for decades. Vincent Antonelli proposed expanding her role to include mediating disputes between families, saying her reputation for fairness and intelligence made her ideal for the position. Isabella accepted, knowing this was recognition of her status as a major power, and the other families agreed without significant resistance because she'd proven herself capable and trustworthy over the past year. Diego told her privately that becoming a mediator meant she'd reached the highest levels of their world, that people trusted her judgment enough to let her make decisions that affected their operations. She thought about the scared woman who'd crashed into Diego's club 3 years ago with nothing but desperation and information, and she marveled at how completely she transformed not just her circumstances, but her fundamental understanding of her own capability. Victor had spent 5 years telling her she was worthless and incompetent, and she'd internalized those messages so deeply that believing she could be powerful had required complete reconstruction of her self-concept. Marcus moved into the mansion in March after Isabella decided she was ready to share her space with someone who made her feel safe instead of threatened. They established routines that felt domestic and normal, cooking dinner together and watching movies and arguing about whose turn it was to handle household tasks. And Isabella discovered she could be both powerful crime boss and regular person in a relationship. Chun updated security protocols to account for Marcus's presence, and Isabella appreciated that her security chief took the relationship seriously enough to protect them both. Marcus had his own dangerous job running enforcement for Isabella's operations, and they'd had to navigate what it meant to love someone who might not come home from work someday. But they decided the risk was worth the connection. April brought unexpected news when Isabella discovered she was pregnant, and the revelation sent her into a panic attack because carrying a child meant vulnerability she hadn't prepared for. Marcus held her through the fear and reminded her that she wasn't the powerless woman Victor had controlled, that she had resources and security and people who would protect both her and their baby. And gradually Isabella's breathing steadied as she processed this new reality. She told Diego and Maria first, and Maria cried with joy, while Diego immediately started calculating security improvements needed for protecting a pregnant boss and eventually a child. Isabella appreciated both reactions because they reflected the dual nature of her life, the personal happiness and the practical dangers that came with her position, and she needed people who understood she had to balance both. The pregnancy changed how other families viewed her, with some seeing it as weakness that could be exploited and others seeing it as humanizing someone they'd found intimidating. Isabella handled both reactions by continuing to operate at the same level of competence and ruthlessness she'd always shown, making it clear that becoming a mother wouldn't make her soft or careless about her organization's interests. Victor heard about the pregnancy through the network that still tracked his movements, and he sent a message congratulating her that felt sincere in ways that surprised Isabella. The message included an apology for everything he'd done and acknowledgement that seeing her thrive proved how much damage he'd caused by trying to control someone who was always meant to be powerful. Isabella read it several times, trying to detect manipulation, but finding only what seemed like genuine remorse. She didn't respond because she owed Victor nothing, not forgiveness or acknowledgement or closure, but she did stop the active surveillance on him because maintaining that connection felt like letting him occupy space in her life he no longer deserved. Diego asked if she was sure, and Isabella said yes. That Victor had become irrelevant to her story, just a painful chapter that had led to better things. Marcus proposed in May with a ring he'd designed himself, incorporating stones that represented their journey together, and Isabella said yes while thinking about how different this proposal felt from when Victor had asked her to marry him. Victor's proposal had been about possession and control, claiming her as his property, while Marcus's proposal was about partnership and choice, asking if she wanted to build a life together as equals. They married in June in a small ceremony at the mansion with only their closest people present, and Isabella wore a dress that accommodated her growing belly while still making her feel beautiful. Diego walked her down the aisle since her father was dead and her mother was still rebuilding their relationship, and Isabella felt grateful for this man who'd given her a second chance at life when she'd arrived broken at his door. The ceremony was simple, but meaningful, with vows they'd written themselves, and when Marcus promised to be her partner, not her owner, Isabella cried because those words acknowledged everything she'd survived to get here. Maria caught the bouquet and joked that after 30 years of marriage, she'd keep it as a reminder that love could be healthy and sustaining. And Isabella hugged her for understanding what this day represented beyond just a wedding. Summer passed peacefully with Isabella managing her organization while preparing for motherhood, and she found herself thinking about what kind of mother she wanted to be. She'd grown up with a mother who chose comfort over truth, who'd looked away when Isabella needed protection. And Isabella was determined to be someone her child could trust absolutely to keep them safe and believe them when they said they were hurt. Chun hired additional security specifically trained in protecting children, and the mansion was modified again to create safe spaces that could be locked down if threats materialized. Isabella appreciated Chen's thoroughness while also feeling sad that her child would grow up knowing danger was possible. But she supposed that was the cost of the life she'd chosen and the power she'd built. Vincent Antonelli threw them a baby shower that was surreal in its combination of dangerous criminals cooing over tiny clothes and discussing whether the nursery security was adequate. Isabella watched these hardened people who'd committed terrible acts arguing about the best baby monitors and felt affection for this strange family she found herself part of. People who understood that you could be deadly and still care about protecting innocence. Her daughter was born in September, exactly 3 years after the Thanksgiving party, where Isabella had arrived in 50 SUVs, and Isabella held this tiny person and felt terror and love in equal measure. She'd brought a child into a dangerous world, but she'd also built enough power to protect that child, and she promised her daughter silently that she would never experience the helplessness Isabella had felt as Victor's wife. They named her Sophia after Marcus's grandmother and Isabella's aunt who died young. And Sophia immediately became the most protected baby in the city with security that rivaled heads of state. Isabella took 3 months away from active operations to focus on motherhood. And she discovered that delegating to trusted people was easier than she'd expected because she'd built an organization full of competent leaders who could function without her constant oversight. Victor sent a gift for Sophia through an intermediary, a children's book about brave little girls that felt like acknowledgement of what Isabella had become, and Isabella accepted it because refusing seemed petty when Victor was clearly trying to demonstrate he'd changed. She never responded or acknowledged the gift directly, but she kept the book and sometimes read it to Sophia while thinking about how survival and bravery weren't the same thing, but both mattered. Marcus was an attentive father who split nighttime feedings and diaper changes equally, and Isabella fell more in love with him watching him care for their daughter with such tenderness. She thought about how Victor had talked about wanting children, but only as possessions that would reflect well on him, while Marcus loved Sophia for herself and wanted her to grow up knowing she was valued beyond what she could provide. Isabella returned to work in December, running operations from home, initially until Sophia's sleep schedule stabilized, and she found that being a mother made her more ruthless about protecting her territory because threats to her organization were now threats to her daughter's security. The other families noticed this shift and became more careful about how they dealt with her, understanding that maternal Isabella was somehow more dangerous than regular Isabella had been. The first attempt on her life came in January when a rival family decided that eliminating Isabella would create opportunities for expansion, and they sent 3 professionals to the mansion expecting her security to have gaps they could exploit. Chen's team neutralized the threat before the attackers got within 100 feet of the house, and Isabella had them delivered to the family that sent them with a message that the next attempt would result in total war. The family's boss apologized profusely and offered substantial compensation, claiming the attack was unauthorized and the men responsible would be punished. Isabella accepted the apology and the compensation while making it clear that she held the family collectively responsible, that authority meant accountability for what happened under your leadership. And the boss agreed quickly because refusing would have meant the war Isabella had threatened. She used the compensation money to establish a scholarship fund for children of people killed in their industry's violence, wanting Sophia to grow up knowing that power could be used to help people, not just hurt them. Diego said she was creating a legacy beyond criminal enterprise, and Isabella said that was exactly what she wanted, to be remembered for more than just surviving Victor and building an empire. Sophia's first birthday brought another attempt to undermine Isabella's position when rumors started spreading that she'd gone soft since becoming a mother, that having a child made her vulnerable and distracted. Isabella handled this by orchestrating a series of strategic moves that expanded her territory and eliminated 2 smaller organizations that had been causing problems, demonstrating that motherhood had made her more efficient, not less effective. The rumors stopped immediately, and Isabella's reputation grew to include not just competence, but the ability to balance multiple complex roles simultaneously. Young women in the organization started approaching her asking how she managed everything. And Isabella found herself mentoring in ways she hadn't anticipated, teaching other women that they didn't have to choose between power and family, but could have both if they built the right support systems. Victor reached out directly for the first time in over a year, asking if they could meet to talk, and Isabella surprised herself by agreeing because she was curious about who he'd become in the time since she destroyed his life. They met in a public place with both their security teams present, and Isabella barely recognized the man sitting across from her because Victor had lost the arrogance and cruelty that had defined him. He told her he'd spent 3 years in therapy working through why he treated her so badly, and he'd come to understand that hurting her had been about his own insecurity and need for control rather than anything she'd done wrong. Isabella listened without interrupting as Victor took full responsibility for the abuse and acknowledged that no amount of apology could undo the damage. But he wanted her to know he understood what he'd done and was actively trying to become someone different. She asked why he was telling her this, and Victor said because she deserved to hear it, that he'd stolen 5 years of her life and marked her with trauma that would probably never fully heal, and the least he could do was acknowledge the truth without excuse or justification. Isabella studied his face, looking for manipulation, but seeing only exhaustion and genuine remorse. And she told him she appreciated the apology, but it didn't change anything between them. Victor said he understood and wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, just wanted her to know that watching her succeed had forced him to confront who he'd been and choose to be better. Isabella said she hoped he meant that because the world didn't need more men who hurt women, and Victor agreed quietly before leaving with his security team. And Isabella watched him go feeling something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but was at least the absence of active hatred. Marcus asked if she was okay after the meeting, and Isabella said yes. That seeing Victor broken and remorseful had given her a closure she hadn't known she needed. She'd spent years being angry at him, and then years being indifferent, and now she'd reached a place where she could acknowledge he'd been a damaged person who'd damaged her, but that chapter was finally completely closed. Sophia's second birthday brought celebration at the mansion with children of Isabella's entire organization playing in rooms that had once held only Victor's cruelty, and Isabella looked around at the laughter and joy and felt proud of the transformation. This house had been her prison and was now her home. These people had been strangers and were now family, and she'd gone from victim to survivor to someone powerful enough to protect others. Diego announced his retirement that spring, saying he was getting too old for the stress and wanted to spend his remaining years with Maria, traveling and enjoying grandchildren. Isabella felt panic at losing her mentor and father figure, but Diego assured her she'd been ready to operate independently for years, and this was just making official what had already been true. The transition was smooth because Isabella had learned everything Diego had to teach and had her own leadership style that people respected. She took over territories Diego had been managing and consolidated her position as one of the 3 most powerful operators in the entire region. And people started calling her the queen, which felt both accurate and slightly ridiculous. Marcus became her official second in command, bringing enforcement and strategy skills that complemented Isabella's diplomatic and business talents. And they became known as a power couple that other families either wanted to align with or were terrified to cross. Sophia grew up surrounded by this power and also by people who loved her unconditionally. And Isabella made sure her daughter learned that being powerful meant being responsible for protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Victor died in a car accident when Sophia was 4, and Isabella felt complicated emotions hearing the news because Victor had been such a defining part of her story even after she'd moved beyond him. She didn't attend his funeral, but she sent flowers with a card that said rest in peace, and she meant it genuinely because she'd stopped needing him to suffer years ago. His death felt like the final closing of that chapter, the absolute end of the part of her life where Victor had any relevance. And Isabella found herself able to think about those years with something approaching neutrality. She'd been hurt badly, but she'd survived and thrived. And Victor's legacy, was that he'd underestimated someone who was always meant to be extraordinary. On the fifth anniversary of arriving at Victor's Thanksgiving party in 50 SUVs, Isabella hosted her own Thanksgiving celebration at the mansion and invited everyone who'd been part of her journey. Diego and Maria came despite retirement. Chin brought her family. Marcus's parents flew in from across the country, and Sophia ran around being doted on by people who'd kill to protect her. Isabella stood at the head of the table and gave a toast thanking everyone for being part of the family she'd chosen, for supporting her through the transformation from broken victim to powerful leader, and for proving that surviving trauma could lead to building something beautiful. She said she was grateful for every person present and every lesson learned, even the painful ones that had taught her who she was capable of becoming. The room raised glasses, and Isabella felt contentment that had seemed impossible when she'd fled this house with broken ribs and terror in her heart. She'd built a life worth living, found love that was healthy and sustaining, created an organization that protected its people, and raised a daughter who would grow up knowing her mother was strong enough to keep her safe. Sophia climbed in her lap and asked if she could have more pie, and Isabella laughed and said yes because saying yes to her daughter's small request felt like healing from all the years Victor had said no to her basic needs. Marcus kissed her temple and whispered that he loved her, and Isabella said she loved him too, loved this life they'd built, loved who she'd become through surviving and thriving. The evening wound down with people lingering over coffee and conversation, and Isabella walked through rooms that had witnessed her worst moments and now held her best memories. She thought about the woman who'd shown up in 50 SUVs to prove she'd survived, and she smiled because that dramatic gesture had been necessary then, but felt unnecessary now. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, didn't need external validation of her power or success, just needed to keep showing up for the people she loved and the organization she'd built. Sometimes the person who hurts you most becomes the catalyst for discovering your own strength, and surviving abuse can transform you into someone powerful enough to help others survive their own darkness. Isabella's story proves that victims can become victors not through becoming like their abusers, but by building something better than what was taken from them. The greatest revenge is living so well that your abuser becomes irrelevant to your happiness. I started writing these stories after leaving my own toxic situation with nothing but a laptop and determination. Sharing survival stories matters. If this resonated, built after someone tried to break you. Next week's story will show you why the people who bet against you always lose.